Hello, everybody, and welcome back to a lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture, we're going to continue right along with our examination of statehood and state building in Southeast Asia, and we're going to look at really the spread of civilization from mainland Southeast Asia into the Pacific Ocean, into what we now call Polynesia. Now, before we begin our lecture proper for today, I just like to do a customary recap and touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So, in our last lecture, we looked at the rise of states, the spread of states in Southeast Asia. We examined we did a broad overview of the rise of Angkor. We described well, not in great detail, and we'll describe it in greater detail at a later date. But we began our examination of the Khmer state, and the Khmer state was the premier state in Southeast Asia for much of the first millennium. The Khmer state organized this area. It was able to tap into the great agricultural potential of this area, and was also able to dominate the sort of trade anchor spots, the chief trading ports of this region. And these trading ports again were port cities or port complexes that facilitated the exchange of goods in the global exchange of goods in the global web of interconnectedness. They were terminuses, far eastern terminuses for the global exchange of goods. And now for our lecture for today. And let me just back up a little bit and say that throughout this course, we have examined civilizations that grew from the urban phenomena, that is, people living in cities, and one that relies heavily on trade contact to thrive and survive. Now, this is true in many examples, but this is not an absolute rule when it comes to civilizations and social organization, or even the promotion of social hierarchies. This is not an absolute rule. Societies can develop sophisticated cultures and not build cities. Now, the most notable cultures that fit into this mold are cultures that continue to pursue hunter-gatherer lifestyles, and they pursue it long after most of humanity have abandoned this. Now, Homo sapiens, and we are Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens are human beings. We emerged about 200,000 years ago, but we have only been farming for roughly 10,000 years. For the rest of that time, humans survived primarily by living as hunter-gatherers, but also scavenging. There was a great degree of scavenging that went along with human human survival. And when you look at it, that timeline from 2,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, it shows that for roughly 95% of human existence, we have been hunter-gatherers. It was our first adaptation to the wider environment. Now, in the presence, a minuscule percentage of humans continue to practice anything relating to hunter-gathering. But nobody really practices the true form of hunting and gathering, and that is hunting and gathering with no access to modern innovations. Now the closest two cultures or two groups that come to practicing true hunter-gathering are the Aborigines of Australia and the Inuits of the Arctic Circle. But they too have access to many modern advancements, and then they have a great they have a great degree of access to them by a large margin. By the time that we are the time that we're covering, the vast majority of humans had made the switch from hunting and gathering to farming or pastoralism. Pastoralism is simply animal keeping. There were still a few societies scattered around the world that still practiced hunting and gathering during this time. And hunting and gathering, let me give the definition of hunting and gathering. Hunting and gathering is defined as pursuing and obtaining foodstuffs from domesticated plants and animals, nuts, berries, fruits, wild grains, fish, insects, and maybe a little scavenging as well, and whatever game could be caught. Now, hunter-gatherers are almost always nomadic. They move around, often traveling behind the herds of wild animals or in loops, depending on the season. Now, this mobility gives them great flexibility to change from location to location depending on circumstances. It also limited their physical possessions to whatever they could carry, and it is really just whatever each individual could carry. Now, the typical possessions of a hunter-gatherer have been pretty consistent throughout history. It is usually some twine or rope, a single cloak, or a single piece of clothing, a bowl or a gourd, and a dual-purpose stick. And this dual-purpose stick can be used for either digging or hunting. Now, socially, hunter-gatherers, they always tend to live in small bands of 10 individuals who are often related to each other. And these societies are often more egalitarian than farming or pastoral communities. They tend to have less structure. There's also more equality between men and women in hunter-gatherer groups. And this is because nearly everyone in the community had to contribute in group activities for group survival, and this includes, of course, the namesake hunting and gathering. Throughout humanity, human beings have been primarily focused with gathering food. That is something that still links us with our earliest ancestors. Now, many hunter-gatherer bands were or are matrilineal. The women in the groups were related by blood, and that various individuals can trace their ancestry through their mothers. And to avoid inbreeding, male members often originate from other groups. Males join groups to find mates, and this structure also tends to give more social power to women than in agricultural or herding communities. We find that in agricultural and herding communities, there was often the exchange of women that sort of went hand in hand with the development of these communities. These exchanges to find mates within the hunter-gatherer societies, they often coincided or with some designated time of the year when a mass of different bands will appear and temporarily forge together in larger communities before dispersing back into smaller groups. Now, in some groups, the dynamic was or is reversed, with males of a group being interrelated and females joining from other groups. So there is that. It's not an absolute rule that all hunter-gathering societies are matrilineal. Some are patrilineal. It really just depends on the group, or I guess the culture. But this phenomenon is observed in other primates. For example, we have observed bonobos and chimpanzees living in exactly the same social structures. Now, once intensive farming and pastoralism had spread around the globe, hunting and gathering societies tended to be found in areas that were not well suited for farming. These would be extremely geographically isolated areas or a mixture of the two. Now, the northern fringe of North America and Eurasia fits this description to a T. It is an icy, frigid zone. Not well suited for farming, and one that is extremely isolated geographically. Now, the people living in this zone developed rich and distinctive cultures. The Inuits, the Yupiks, the Aleuts, they evolved an array of technologies and strategies that were adapted to enable them to survive in a polar environment. They often had to specialize in certain food gathering activities, such as whale and seal hunting. They had access to neither metals or woods, so they had to construct boats that enabled them to hunt for those selected prey animals, and they had to use the materials they had on hand. In Scandinavia, the ancestors of the Sami people were a tribe known as the Finii. They inhabited the Arctic Circle of Scandinavia, and they lived there from roughly around early 2000 BCE. Now, the Finni are known to the Romans. Tacitus, a Roman chronicler, and we've discussed Tacitus before. Tacitus also examined the Germanic tribes. He wrote about them. Tacitus chronicled or highlighted that this group does not farm, and it struck him as odd. Everybody else was farming except for this group. Tacitus also recorded that the Finni do not construct houses, they wore animal skins, they had no horses or metals, they used arrows with bone tips, and that both men and women took part in the hunt. Again, hinting at the egalitarian nature of these hunting and gathering societies that were needed for the group's survival. Now, the Sami now herd reindeer. That's what they're most famous for in the Arctic Circle region of Scandinavia. But again, this is a rather new practice for the Sami. They only began to herd reindeer about 500 years ago. Now, the San, or the Bushmen of Africa, and the Aborigines of Australia are also notable hunting and gathering groups. And they've been practicing this for extremely long times, and their actions, their hunting and gathering lifestyle, they continue, of course, into the present. Now, both groups adapted to living in regions with minimal rainfall. They develop a wide range of techniques for surviving in an uncompromising environment. Now, the San are a branch of the Khoisan, who have lived in the Kalahari Desert throughout the historical era. And the Aborigines have been living in Australia for around 40 to 50,000 years. Aboriginal culture is the oldest culture known of all human cultures still in practice. When the Aboriginals first arrived in Australia, the landscape was way more hospitable than it is today, with the first settlers living along the coastline, but they later spread inland and they began to occupy the drier, more arid zones of Australia. Now, Aboriginals lived in small hunter-gatherer groups, typical, and it was really just in the same small kin-based groups that exemplifies all hunter-gathering societies. The Aboriginals once spoke many different languages. It's been estimated that there were somewhere between 250 to 600 dialects, but tragically, most of them have been lost. The life of the Aboriginals were regulated by a complex series of rituals and initiation ceremonies that marked transitions from childhood, adulthood, married life, and of course child raising. Now, the Aboriginals mainly used stone to build their tools, but they occasionally used wood and bone in their toolkit arsenals. Now, the most well-known Aboriginal tool is of course the boomerang, which could be used to take down wild game or birds. By at least 10,000 years ago, Aboriginals were utilizing what we call true boomerangs. And true boomerangs are boomerangs that return to the thrower. Now, the boomerang is a stark contrast to the one-way throwing tools used by every other culture. The boomerang also stands in contrast to the bow and arrow, which nearly every other culture develops at one point or another. The bow and arrow was never developed or adapted by the Aborigines, and that's because they developed the boomerang, which some would argue is a superior tool to the bow and arrow. Now, the Aborigines, within their toolkit, they developed barbed spears, they developed darts that could be flung from throwers, and they use all of these along with other clever techniques to trap game to support their groups, their bands. Now, the Aboriginals also traded with one another, and they participated in a wide trade network that really encompassed all of Australia. They bartered rare resources with one another, because of this trade system, we find pearls and shells that come from the coastal regions of Australia, hundreds of miles inland. Now, the religious beliefs of the Aboriginals emphasize the continuity of the past and the present, or at least the continuity of the past to the present, I should say. Their ancestors were venerated. All Aboriginal groups share a belief in a set of behaviors and rituals and times that have to do with their sacred practices. Now, there is a belief that there are spirits that have existed since the time of creation, and these spirits continue to influence the present, and they continue to be a part of the present world. Now, the Aboriginals also have a very colorful history of the origin of animals, and these stories help them and their culture to make sense of the world and connect to those living in it. And those underlying functions of nature really sort of hint at the greater philosophy or the greater social ideas behind Aboriginal society. Now, this is exemplified by the identification of a particular animal that is tied to a tribe or a clan and plays a major role in its origin and their art. Aboriginal art is also known widely for having a very unique and aesthetic form, and for employing a technique of forming pictures from little colored dots. Now, Aborigines and Aboriginal artists, they paint on rocks, on animal skins, bark, and of course human bodies. And they primarily use charcoal, but they also use reds and browns and yellows and whites in their art, in their artwork. Now, Aborigine art depicts everyday life, but it also taps into a rich tapestry of spiritual beliefs. There are there are examples, very very prominent examples, really, of Aboriginal art being used to share personal histories, and this kind of art, this visual form is very striking, particularly when it's the body art that they use to share their personal histories or their clan histories. Now, rock art is another form of art popularized and used in Aboriginal societies. Now, rock art was used. Was used and is made by simply applying pigment to the rock or by hammering at the rock until the surface becomes abraded to create an engraving. Now, some rock art that we find, some rock art and some rock engravings date to over 20,000 years ago. Now, in addition to these hunter-gatherer societies, there are also some non-urban, but still hunter-gathering societies. And among them are the Pacific Islanders, or the Polynesians. And they constitute one of the more remarkable cultures, specifically because they adapted to a particular environment. And in this case, the environment was Oceania or Oceania. Literally the islands of the Pacific Ocean, the islands off the coast of Southeast Asia, and these islands arc out into a chain of thousands of islands. These islands arc out into the Philippines, Indonesia, parts of Australia, New Guinea, the Hebrides, Tasmania, and they stretch out even further into the Pacific, because the Marshall Islands, Fiji, Samoa, the Society Islands, and Northern Marianas, they all fit into this Polynesian world. And the northern edge of this Polynesian world, this Pacific Ocean world, would be, of course, the Hawaiian Islands, and the southern edge of this world would be New Zealand, and the far east of this world would be Easter Island. Now, between 3000 and 1500 BCE, the Austronesians, a seafaring people, began to spread out from Southeast Asia through all of these islands. And their point of origin was around modern-day Taiwan. Now, the earliest distinct culture that to form from this group is known as the Lapita culture. and from around 1500 they had settled in Melanesia, which is the island range to the north of Australia. Now, the Lapita culture is best known from a distinctive style of pottery that they produced. This pottery was produced from Melanesia, and from Melanesia, they expanded westward into what we call Polynesia. They reached Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa by 900 BCE. The Lapita, however, they did not practice true farming. They created temporary fields using slash and burn agriculture. They then placed imported plants into these fields, and these imported plants would have been crops or foodstuffs such as yams and breadfruit, and these are crops that they brought with them. Now, the Lapita also introduced chickens and dogs to the islands that they went to. Now, the islands of Western Polynesia are as far as the evidence of Lapita culture reaches. But we know that the descendants of the Lapita culture, their descendants crossed the Pacific Ocean. They went into eastern Polynesia. They reached the Cook Islands and Tahiti by 300 BCE. And these explorers, the descendants of these explorers, they pushed boldly into the open ocean. They reached Easter Island and the Hawaiian Island by 500. And the last of these oceanic explorers, they reached New Zealand in the 13th century, where they would establish the roots of Maori culture. Now, the islands that the seafarers settled were not very promising zone for intensive agriculture. The only edible indigenous plants were some nuts. Most of the plants that we associate with these regions, bananas and coconuts, yams and breadfruits, they were all imported by these island voyagers. The islands of the Pacific are volcanic islands whose soils are not very deep, and they're subject to intense sea storms that deposit salt water over these small islands. And of course, the salinity of the salt water reduces the agricultural output capacity of these islands. Now, the islanders persisted and they thrived, and they did so by employing limited cultivation of the imported foodstuffs, along with herding. They herded imported animals, and what made it more than just a marginal existence with the ocean resources many of these islands had. Many of these islands are atolls. They are surrounded by extensive coral reefs, and the coral reefs are incredibly rich marine environments. The Pacific Islanders, I should say, became expert fishermen. They became experts at netting, hooking, and harpooning the wealth of seafood around their island homes. Now, collectively, we refer to the people of these islands as Polynesians, but they do not constitute a single political or cultural unit. Each island, and in some instances, each sphere on an island evolved its own communal variant of the core of the core culture of this region. Often, this was really just predetermined. Their own communal variant was predetermined, often being influenced by the environmental resources, and also the community's development of separate languages or dialects. Now, over 1,200 languages have been identified in Oceania so far. The languages are closely related and often intelligible to the other groups. Body art, like tattoos, are also found among all of these cultures, and a related hierarchical social structure centered on a hegemon or king overseeing trade was also a very common feature of these societies, of these groups. Now, Polynesian success rested on their ability as sailors. Shipbuilders, and of course navigators, because they're crossing the open oceans. And they crossed thousands of miles of open ocean without the use of compasses to find these tiny islands. This was a very complicated challenge for the original settlers. these islands, and they risked certain death in the vast expanse of the open ocean. Now, the complication of traveling from Asia and spreading eastward uh, weren't really all that difficult, because the main currents and winds, they move westward. These sailors had to struggle with nature to explore and to find new territories. Now, the Lapita developed a very sophisticated boat design, and their boats are really just seafaring canoes with a very large sail. But they were able to use these sails because of the outriggers that allowed them to stabilize their seagoing canoes. Now, the original canoes were hollowed out logs, which allowed for island hopping, and this allowed them to hop from island to island until they reached Samoa. Now, during the initial phase of expansion, the islands were not really too far spaced out. So the sailors could easily hop from island to island without having to brave long stretches at sea without the sight of land. The canoes were propelled by paddles and a triangular Latien sail, and this allowed them to tack into the wind. These boats, however, were not very large. They were not large enough to carry the supplies necessary to travel to the more spaced out islands of the Pacific. The later Polynesians devised a new type of canoe, a much bigger craft, which was built out of planks, and well, not built out of planks. It was still two hollowed out, dug out canoes, but it had planks attached to them. The canoes were tacked together, I should say, by planks, and they were attached end to end. And then they were sort of they sort of used adhesives and coconut fibers to bind them together to make sure that the two canoes didn't come apart in rough weather. Now, instead of a hull with a outrigger, this new form of ship had two hulls that were linked by that aforementioned platform that was joined together with the coconut fibers and adhesives. Now, the largest of these had been measured to be over 100 feet long, and it had enough space to carry enough cargo and crew members to travel thousands of miles over the open ocean. Now, they were steered by paddles, but they were very capable and effective ocean-going vessels. Now, the challenge for the Polynesians was really navigation, and they fine-tuned their navigation skills through a mixture of trial and error. And really, sometimes it was just the culmination of a lifetime of experience on the open water that made the Polynesian sailors master navigators. Without and what's really more striking is that they did so without any of the advanced technology that would accompany other maritime traditions. Polynesians learned to use stars, birds, clouds, and currents, and even wave patterns to guide them. The Polynesian sailors were able to identify land when it was out of sight by the changes in ocean swells, variance in the wind, or current directions, and of course the sight of terrestrial birds. The Polynesians cultivated an awareness of the complex and detailed movements of the stars, learning to estimate direction and distance based on astronomical observation. Now, in the Marshall Islands, navigators developed charts using the ribs of coconut fronds. Now, these charts are not maps, but they indicate patterns and directions of the currents. They also show at least 4 different types of ocean swells that could be used to guide sailors to particular destinations. Now, although the Polynesians were a non-urban people, they were able to establish a successful, rich, and long-lasting culture while making some truly outstanding advancements in seafaring and also navigation, seafaring and navigation. Their achievements are among some of the more outstanding and notable achievements in human history. Now there are other hunter-gathering societies that I did not get a chance to get to in this lecture. One would be the Ainu of Japan. And in a world where more and more people are living in cities, cultures such as these that demonstrate that urbanism is not the only expression for complex society, I feel noteworthy and should be talked about, should be remembered, and also should be studied more in depth. All right, now that concludes our lecture for today. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. I hope you found it entertaining. I have a deep admiration for Polynesian society, for the navigational and the seafaring accomplishments of these great giants in maritime history. Let me know what you thought about it. I am Ted, and I'll see you guys next time as we continue our discourse on Asian history.